Welcome back. Ready to pick up your books and continue reading Willa of the Wood? Because I know I am. I have gotten my copy out and turned to chapter 42. Willa is certainly learning a lot from the Stay Folk man, and I can't wait to see how their adventure continues to evolve. So I have turned to page 210 in my copy, and I'm ready to start reading. In the days that followed, it was one strange incident after another. She ate with the man Nathaniel while sitting at something he called his dinner table. She ate with him and the dog by the warm glow of the fire in the evenings. She watched him work in his mill in the afternoons with the turning of the millstone, grinding the wheat into flour while they talked. Sometimes they walked together in the forest, teaching each other the ways they saw the world. She learned many new English words, like that he called his killing stick a rifle or a gun, and she taught him the foreign names of many of the plants and animals in the forest. When he showed her how to operate the mill, she taught him the songs of the birds flitting in the trees above their heads. There's something that has always confused me about the English language, she admitted one afternoon as they walked in the forest. What is it? He asked. She stopped and pointed to the needles of a pine tree. What color do you call that? Green, he said. In the Fairy language, that color is called orunda, she said. So if the pine needles are what you call green, then what color is that? She pointed to fresh grass growing in a small patch of sunlight. That's green too, he said. But that's Finlandland, she said in confusion. They are totally different colors. Light green, he shrugged. It's still green. What about the color there? She said, pointing to the shiny, waxy leaves of a rhododendron bush. Green, he said. No, she said in exasperation. That's a different color. You can see the difference in your eyes, right? Looks like green to me, he said. Maybe a slightly different shade, but it's still green. How many words do you have in your language for the green colors you see in the forest? She shook her head. I don't know. They're all different colors to me, but at least 40 or 50. I'll stick with regular old green, thank you, he said with a small smile, bumping her gently with his arm. As they continued through the forest, she couldn't help from taking a quiet, contented sigh. There was something about spending time with this unusual human that felt surprisingly like her soul was swimming in the warm water of the sacred lake of the bears. But every morning the man Nathaniel grabbed his killing stick and trudged into the forest in the direction of the river, with his dog Scout at his side. He did not tell her where he was going or what he was doing, and it was clear that he didn't want to talk about it. Curious to know what he was doing, she slipped through the undergrowth and watched him from a distance. He followed the bank of the river downstream close along the jagged, moss-covered rocks, many of them towering over his head, others low and tumbled, with the water flowing between them. The dog ran up and down the bank, his nose on to the ground, looking for scent, working with the man Nathaniel, seeming to understand what he was looking for and as anxious to find it as he was. The man and the dog came to a shallow section of the river where it was clear the man wanted to cross, but the water was running strong even here. To her amazement, the man slung his rifle by its leather strap over his back, picked his dog up in his arms, and began to wade across. He plowed slowly through the current with forceful, deliberate steps as the water crashed against his thighs. Be careful, Willa whispered as she watched from the trees, the palms of her hands sweating. She could imagine the powerful current pulling the man Nathaniel off his feet and sweeping him and the frantically swimming dog down into the rocky rapids below. When they finally reached the other side, the man leapt from his arms and shook himself dry, and then the two of them continued on their way, receding into the distance further downstream on the opposite bank of the river. She thought the man and his dog must be going out to hunt for their food, and that he wasn't talking about it because he knew it would bother her. But then, when they returned later that afternoon, the man wasn't just empty-handed, but solemn and exhausted, like he'd gone to the ends of the earth. His boots and trousers were soaked, his hands roughened by the abrasion of stone, and his clothes were torn. Willa's brows furrowed in confusion. Where was he going every day? What was he doing out there? She watched from her spot in the top of the sourwood tree as they came up from the river. The man ran into the house, his tail wagging, excited to be home. Maybe looking for her, she thought, but the man Nathaniel didn't go in. He walked in silence to the meadow near the house where the rays of the setting sun were shining down. He stood there alone, unmoving and unchanging for a long time, except for the glisten of light trickling down his cheeks. As she watched him, she felt as if the world was being held together, held in that moment, as if she could barely breathe, couldn't move, her heart slowing to a low, steady, thumping beat, as if in that moment she could reach out across the distance between them, and without any knowing or understanding or words, knowing that the man Nathaniel was feeling. Later that evening, with the feeling of that moment still in her heart, she went down to the river and sat by herself, listening to the water flowing between the stones and remembering the sound of her grandmother's foreign voice. She remembered the look in her grandmother's eyes and the warmth of her touch. She saw her mama had wrapped her in her arms, as if she were encasing her in a cocoon that would protect her forever. And Willa remembered playing games of hide and seek with her sister Aloha in the dappled shade of the wooded dells, the two of them blending from one place to another as they took turns hiding from one another. She remembered the smile that lit up Aloha's little spotted face whenever Willa found her. They played through the sunlight days and the moonlit nights, running and blending and searching and laughing over and over again. Sitting there by the river on her own, she could see it all in her mind. And she could hear the soft sound of Aloha's voice as they explored the forest together with their mama and their parents. She remembered Aloha talking to a nest of frightened sparrows that had fallen from a tree. The way she cupped the little birds in her hands and reassured them that she would put them back where they belonged. Willa remembered it all, but as the sound of the foreign words drifted from her memory, it was like the whispers of the water flowing down the tumbling river. And as the moon rose from the darkened peak of the great mountain looming in the distance, the man Nathaniel came down to the river and sat beside her in the quiet and seemed to understand not just her sense of silence, but her sense of loss. He seemed to know, as if from his own experience, that there were parts of her life that he could not understand, words from her past that she longed to hear, but he could not speak. The next day, while the man Nathaniel was away from the river, Willa remained in the forest near the house. Every day, whenever she was and whatever she was doing, she had been practicing her woodland skills. Her mama had taught her the long history of her sky-reaching friends and the other plants and all the ancient words and whispers she needed to converse with them. And now that she had begun to learn more and more on her own, she realized there was so much more she wanted to understand and do. She practiced lying on the ground in a patch of ferns and vines, and then asking the plants to grow across her body until she disappeared. Not just blending the color and texture of her skin, but by physically covering the entirety of her body with the growth of the plants. She was able to achieve the growth she wanted, but it turned out to be surprisingly difficult to actually get out of the ferns and vines once they'd grown over her. The plants seemed to like holding on to her with their tiny, sticky stems and their curling tendrils adhering to her skin. As she was climbing out of the vine, she noticed a small slug slithering over a nearby rock. That was one of the few creatures of the forest she didn't like. But this time, it repulsed her even more than usual. The slug's mucus-coated skin reminded her of the Pataran when he caught his foot in the jaws of the trap. She still couldn't figure out exactly what she had seen when she glanced back to look at him, but the image had stuck in her memory. The Pataran had always had deep bronze skin that seemed to be filled with light. But for that single moment when he was in terrible pain and distress, his skin had turned as gray and slimy as a slug. Back when she was a jader stealing for the clan, she thought the Padaran was a great leader, feared and respected by all, the wise father to her struggling people. But now that she had left the lair, she wondered why she had hated the old ways so deeply, why he had been trying so desperately to wipe out the last remnants of the wood witches and their forest powers. What harm had they been doing? She hated the dark memories of her old life. She didn't want to think about the dead hollow lair or the Padaran, but questions kept sneaking into her mind like little worms. Where did he come from? Who was he? She had heard stories that the Padaran wasn't a normal Faron like the other members of the clan, that he had come down from the top of the great mountain to lead the Faron people, and it had been easy to believe. But what confused her now was that she had actually climbed the great mountain, felt its presence in her heart, and heard its voice in her soul. She remembered vast clouds of mist and a soaring hawk and trees and mountains for as far as the eye could see. But she didn't see any sign that the Padaran or anyone like him had ever been there. Near the end of the day, when she heard the man Nathaniel coming her way, she relaxed her blend so that he could see her. As he walked up to her, a vine was growing along her arm and around her wrist, like a dayfolk bracelet, and another was twining up into her hair. The man watched the movement of the vines in silence, astonished and transfixed by what he was seeing. "How do you do that?" he asked softly. Willa tried to think of a way to explain it in English words, but it was difficult. "With my mind, and sometimes my voice, I ask the vines to move." "Have you always been able to do this?" "My mama has been teaching me all my life, and I've been practicing more and more." What do you call what you do?" "In the Faron language, it used to be called Asperia. In English, we call it woodcraft." "Woodcraft?" he repeated slowly, as if he was trying to absorb both the sound of it and the meaning of what he was seeing. "Years ago, many of my people had the knowledge and the power of woodcraft. It still runs very strong in the members of a few families. My mother and father and my sister all had the power, and my grandmother was the one who taught me. But I think I must be the last of the whisperers now." "The whisperers," the man Nathaniel said in gentle surprise. "I like the sound of that. And you and your people call yourselves Faron? Is that right?" Willa smiled and nodded. "And you and your people call yourselves human? Is that right?" The man Nathaniel smiled. "Yes, at least once I've had my breakfast in the morning." She liked the way he smiled when he said these words, and she liked the way it made her feel. "Listen, I came over to ask you. I need to go check on something, and I thought you might want to come along with me. I think I could use your help." Willa rose to her feet, pleased to be included. A while later, as she walked along with the man Nathaniel and the dog Scout through the forest, she asked, "Where are we going?" "We left the edge of the property behind us," he said, making his way through the undergrowth of the trees. "But I saw something back here in the woods that's been festering in my mind." "What do you mean, your property?" she asked. "My land," he said, "the property I own." She still didn't understand. As they walked along, Scout stayed close at her side. He had become used to her and her to him. She liked the way he was always looking ahead, always scanning with his eyes and nose and ears. She thought there must be a little bit of woof in him. When she reached down to pet his head, he looked up at her, and she was surprised to see the worry in his eyes. He was smelling something ahead of them that he didn't like one bit. She turned to Nathaniel and saw he was anxious as well. They soon came to a footpath, and Nathaniel stopped. "Can you sense anything?" he asked her. "Do you see anything unusual?" Understanding that he wanted her to put her woodland skills to work, she crouched to the ground and looked at the earth. the lichen, and leaves. She noticed the way some of the ferns were bent and a few of the leaves were pressed down. Humans have been walking here, she said, all of them wearing heavy boots, one of them dragging some kind of tool or object behind him. How many men? He asked. At least 4, she said, looking around at the footprints. Fear clouded Nathaniel's face. How? Can you tell how long ago? Checking the amount of wear and dryness on the edges of the footprints and thinking about the last time it had rained, she said, Yesterday. That's not good, he said, shaking his head. Let's follow the tracks a little ways and see what we can learn. As they walked on, they both noticed long red strips of cloth that had been tied onto some of the larger oak trees. What are they? She asked. They're marking the most important trees to cut, he said, his voice filled with fear and anger all at once. I don't understand, she said. The thought of cutting down these beautiful trees made her eyes water, and she could feel the heat rising up into her face. These men are scouts for the logging company, surveying the forest to determine which groves of trees to cut first, and finding the best route for the railroad to come up into the mountains. They've got a new kind of engine that puts power to all its wheels so it can handle hauling full loads of logs down the mountain slopes. But even the new engines have limits, so they have to map out their path. So they're coming up here now, she said, her voice cracking in dismay. Right now, what they want most is my land, he said. I own a section along the river, the only one flat enough for them to get their railroad line and their equipment up onto the rest of the mountain where they want to cut. So whatever you do, Willa, you need to avoid this area of the forest from now on. It's going to be too dangerous. Don't ever let those loggers see you. As he said these words, she could hear the trembling fear in his voice. It felt like she could almost see the future he was seeing, and it frightened her to her bone. In that moment, Scout brushed past her leg and took to sniffing something on the ground. Then he began to follow the scent of the path. Scout's onto something, Nathaniel said, moving towards him. They followed the dog into the forest until Willa saw something on the ground up ahead. Wait, she whispered to the man Nathaniel, touching his side to bring him to a stop. When she crouched down, he crouched with her. What do you see? He whispered, peering in the direction she was looking. It was well disguised in the leaves, but she could see it. It was definitely there. Scout, come, she said, her voice quiet but firm, using the words she'd heard Nathaniel use, and she was relieved that the dog quickly returned to her side. What do you see up there? Nathaniel asked her again, sensing her anxiousness. She pointed towards the ground 10 or 20 paces in front of them. Look carefully, just ahead of us, by the roots of that oak tree and along the forest floor, over to that chestnut tree. Do you see it? It's a net hidden beneath the leaves. It's some sort of trap, he whispered. Someone must be trying to capture an animal of some sort. Do you think it belongs to the loggers? She asked. I've never seen them use anything like that before. They've been more interested in laying railroad tracks and cutting trees than hunting and trapping, but maybe they've been having trouble with a local bear. But for the life of me, I don't understand why they would want to catch a bear in a net. Seems like it's just asking for a face full of claws. Do any humans other than loggers use this path? She asked. Yes, definitely, he said. Some of the other homesteaders use it, and so do I. Willa stared at the net, not sure what to do, but Nathaniel suddenly rose up and moved past her. He picked up a large branch and heaved it into the center of the trap. The net sprang up with a loud, violent swoosh, bringing up an explosion of leaves with it. Then he pulled out the long knife he carried on his belt and cut the net down. I don't know who did this or why, but something like this doesn't belong in these woods, he said angrily as he sliced the net to pieces and rendered it useless. Then he touched her on the shoulder and gestured in the direction of the house. Come on, let's get out of here before somebody sees us. We have come to the end of chapter 43, and next time we will continue on the adventure through Willa of the Wood. Look forward to seeing you then.